it coincides with my nomination as Ombudsman for Children. I think it's a good omen, I hope. Very good omen. I'm sure you were all glued to the Oireachtas TV today to see that I got past the first hurdle in the draw, and I have to worry about people in the Senate now tomorrow, and then if that works out okay, I end up going to the President next week, so I have to get a new hat. Donegal tweed or something like that. So I'm delighted to be here. I wasn't quite sure how to pitch this talk, so what I've done is I've set up slides that hopefully will explain the work we do and the sort of impact we have, and a couple of case examples. I've taken a couple of ones specifically written to children in sort of child and mental health area. But I got a telephone call today from somebody who said they were looking forward to the talk and seeing how psychology relates to the governance of public bodies. And I thought, that'd be great too. I must try something. I must take a look at that. So I'll see if I can squeeze some of that in now. It won't be on the slides, but I'll try and fit something into psychology and governance and stuff. So as we go along. Usually, I don't know if we want to do talk or do you want to have questions at the end. What's the normal format here? I'm quite happy to go either way. Will we go through it and then give the conversation at the end? Would that be okay? Great. Okay. Okay, so 10 years of growing. I couldn't come up with any other puns about puberty and adolescence and stuff, but it's 10 years. That it was set up, I think, officially April 2004. So it'll be my job as a parent now to bring them into the teenage years, screaming and kicking and sulking and all the stuff that I have to deal with in the office over the next 6 years of my appointment. So we'll see how that goes. I'll come back to you in 6 years' time and see how the child is growing up. Okay, so how does it work? We were set up in 2002. Brian Lenihan was the Minister for Children, or it would have been a sort of junior ministry at the time. The Ombudsman for Children Act set up 2002. It was groundbreaking in the way the appointment was made. For the first time ever, they involved children right from the start. The children designed the ad for the newspaper. They designed the interviews, and they were involved in all the interview stages. Since then, over the last 10 years, the office has been continuously getting calls from all over the world to repeat that and to help people set up similar systems all over the world. So it really is international best practice, and it happened again this year. And they involved the children right from the start as well. So I think it was a very, very strong message for how they wanted the office to go, and I think it's to great credit to the Minister from that regard. It's a presidential appointment, so in the same way that ministers get their seal of office, I have to go out next week and get a warrant of appointment, which means that I'm independent of ministers. It's a statutory office, so my response and my responsibility is back to the Oireachtas. The only connection I have with any ministry is that just for lines of accounting, the money comes through Department of Children and Youth Affairs to my budget. That's it. After that, I have to report to the Oireachtas, so I have an annual report that I deliver in there every year, and there'll be I have the option of going into various committees as well. So over the years, my predecessor Emily Logan would have run talks to the Oireachtas Committee on Justice, on Health, on Children, probably public accounts. I'm not quite sure. So we have that opportunity to go into the Oireachtas in those various different elements. And I think that's a crucial part, because the independence is vital. I think people who want to bring complaints to us want to know that we're not going to be kowtowing to any minister who says, you know what, if you take this complaint, I'm going to pull your budget or whatever. So we've had continuous tensions with lots of departments, but they can't go too far on us in that regard. And I think it's the one thing that's left. If we could get the total independence, where the money would come through the Oireachtas directly through a committee or something, that would completely move away any suspicion that a minister could put any pressure on us. Because there is always that outside chance. It's never been an issue, but it's always that outside chance that a minister could say, listen, we're going to cut your budget. And we've seen it in other areas where that has happened. So that's something we'll be pushing. I'll be pushing very hard for us to change the legislation in that regard. Okay, the functions. We have three main functions, and I'll go through these in a bit more detail, but the highlights of them are the independent complaints handling function. And I think it's crucial. The independence is crucial, but we provide the service so that the actions of any public body affecting children up to the age of 18 can be looked at. there was an amendment to our Act in 2012 which brought in a title called a reviewable agency, in which it's now in the legislation that organisations that are substantially funded by the government to do work in relation to children could be reviewed by ourselves, could be under our legislation. In theory, that could mean NGOs, it could mean charities, it could mean any organisation that's doing a function that the government should be doing but are doing it through the function. So they're subcontracted to some extent. It hasn't happened yet. We haven't gone looking for that because nobody quite defined what substantial meant. Does that mean 20%, 30%, 51%, 49%? We haven't got that far, but we're getting close to having an idea, and I understand that we are tied to the Ombudsman Act, so I think the Ombudsman is looking at this as well, where there's things like nursing homes for adults would be in sort of the same area. They'd be sort of private but substantially funded by the government. So that area will open up in the future. The other two parts of our work are children's rights and education. So we are an independent human rights monitor. We run the rule of UNCRC. We actively promote it through children's workshops and education packages that we do. And again, I'll go into that in more detail. But it's the real centre of our work is the UNCRC rights of the child. We really look at that. We use that every opportunity we can, and a lot of our investigations will have at the back we'll have an outline of where we believe any of the human rights have been breached in relation to the investigations. Policy and legislation. So again, this is one of the things that was very, very foresightful by Brian Lenihan and the government at that time. You don't always say that, you don't say that too often about governments, but in this case, what they did is they made it a legitimate opportunity for us to comment on legislation prior to it going into the Oireachtas. So rather than waiting for consultation or submissions to be called for, a government minister can refer legislation to us so that we can, for want of a better word, childproof it as early as possible, or point out issues that we think children are where they're not being considered, or they're not being considered in the way we believe should be considered. So the rights are looked after the best way possible. And again, I'll give you examples of where we've done that. We monitor it, so even if we aren't invited to do it, we can certainly make a submission to government, and it is to be. We have clout, for want of a better way. They have to hear it. Okay, they don't necessarily have to follow it, but it has to be recognised. So they're the three main functions, and again, that piece of it, the legislation, is part of most children ombudsman's functions, but the individual complaints handling is an unusual one across many ombudsman functions. Policy and legislation. So what sort of areas do we go into? Primary legislation that we've worked on in the last while has been the Children's First Bill, and again, anyone who's been involved with children's organisations. I previously worked with CARI, which worked with children who are affected by abuse, and we would have made a submission on this as well. So the Ombudsman would have put a strong submission on the various elements of that Children's First Bill. The criminal justice withholding information and offences against children and vulnerable persons. So again, we would have put input on that in a way that allowed us to comment on the various interactions between the two bills as well. The Education Admissions Bill is one that's still in the process of coming before the Parliament. That's one I'll refer to in a minute, that relates to some of our complaints. But it's an important piece. That's the one that's going to change the rules for admissions. Anyone who's signed up for a child in school and has a waiting list and all these sort of areas, this is the one that's going to change all that. The waiting list will be disbanded over the next, in theory, 2-3 years, whatever. There's a whole lot of other changes coming with that, if it comes out in the way it was suggested to come out. The Criminal Law Sexual Offences Bill, that's a big one that's coming out in the near future. It was only named, I think, I don't know, it was this side of Christmas or just before it, where there's a whole lot of issues in that, like compulsory risk assessments for sex offenders, criminalising the purchase of sex, higher sentences, bigger sentences for sexual offending against children who've been trafficked, or prostitutes who've been trafficked. It's a bigger offence, bigger sentences to come down on that. So there's a whole range of stuff going on within that bill. And again, we have to take our time and try and filter out what we believe are the important parts for children and how we can improve the bill in relation to children. And we have a policy and legislation unit. He doesn't always like to be called a unit, but it sounds better, I think. So it's a lot of work done by a small number of people. We have a small team. Highlighting the voices of the children, hearing and highlighting the voices of the children. And this is the piece that I really love. The office often sort of fights above its weight. We've a total of 15 when we were full house. With the loss of the Ombudsman, and we've lost a couple of people since then, so we're down smaller numbers than that at the moment. We're trying to get back up the track. But within that, the Big Ballot, just one of the examples, the Big Ballot back in 2007, Emily wanted to get the views of the children all around the country. She engaged with every single school in the country, 3,000 schools, literally hired a bus, went around the schools, set up a ballot on the same day that there was a I think it was 2007, was there an election? I don't know if it was exactly the same day or the day before, but she mirrored the ballot or the election and allowed children to go and vote on the issues that they wanted to vote on. 70,000 children got involved and came up, and the count was done in not Dublin Castle, Dublin City Hall, and huge sense of democracy, huge sense that children were being engaged for the first time around those sort of issues, and they got their voices heard. And we took on some of those issues, and they became the sort of mission for the organisation for a period of time. Ironically, that's the only element of our work in 10 years that was ever brought into the High Court. It's an unusual one. Just people felt that there was an element of discrimination in certain parts of it. I won't go into too much detail, but that was the only part. So it's an unusual one. But to me, it was a hugely powerful piece of work. Over here we have, this would have been the Youth Advisory Panel, and most of them would have, the pictures there, you can't quite see them well, but they would have been a lot of the young people who were involved in the initial interviews. So they set up the core of a Youth Advisory Panel, which was in place for maybe 7 or 8 years. There was a 3-year cycle, and then we changed every 3 years. They're not in place now at the moment, because what we found, and the children themselves, the young people themselves decided this, that they felt as we moved into more, I was going to say marginalised, but more specific areas of children with issues, that the generalised Youth Advisory Panel didn't know how to deal with it, what to give us. So we actually had to go and find panels. So you'll see we talked about homeless, we talked about children who are separated, asylum seekers. The Youth Advisory Panel as a general core didn't know or didn't have anything to give. So they felt it was best for them to disband themselves as we moved into those areas and try and get more specific youth advisory panels in that regard. The big debate, this is a more recent one. So in relation to the children's referendum, obviously we're apolitical. The office cannot come out and make statements on one side or another in a political debate. We felt that when the referendum was about to take off, nobody had actually asked the children again. So we organised, I think something like 40 schools to come to the Aviva Stadium on the Wednesday before the election, or before the referendum, which was a Saturday. We had Joe Duffy come in to host the debate. We had 4 people on either side. We nominated them, so they didn't select their own side. We forced them into a position. Four children, 4 young people, I think they were probably between 13 and 16, from different schools. Each one was from a different school. They had to go off and research to come back in. Their own school was there to cheer them on. Phenomenal energy, phenomenal buzz about it. A lot of people complained that they didn't know about it, that they'd never been engaged with it, and nobody asked them about this, even though it was a children's referendum. Phenomenal arguments on both sides, and the piece that put the wind up all of us was that when we voted, we got a majority of only 53%. We felt this was way off kilter. But come Saturday, we got exactly the same result. So it just shows you that the pulse, when you listen to children and allow them their voice, it's amazing how close to reality, how close they are to it. They literally mirrored society as it was. And I think to me that was a huge learning process, because we were hoping that somebody else might do this. We pulled it together within about 4 weeks. Got this up and running, and it really, for me, was a really powerful example of hearing the voice of the child in a way that just allows them to feel as if they made a real contribution. And as I say, we were petrified we might have lost the debate, but if that had been the case, we wouldn't have been far off society either, probably. So I think it was a really good learning curve for all of us. The issues that we've done in relation to them, so as I said, we've separated children seeking asylum. So again, we've a good group of people that help us put this work together. We went out and met about 30 different children in that situation. There's a lot less in that situation now, separated children seeking asylum. At that time, the young people were being held in less than appropriate settings. We felt there was a huge discrimination between them and somebody who was an Irish citizen who was on their own and was held in a foster situation or whatever type of residential care might be appropriate. After 5 o'clock, the staff would leave and they'd be looked after by security guards who had no training whatsoever. So that report became very strong and very stinging of the situation. I think within 3 or 4 months that was done away with, and the children were incorporated into the same system as any Irish child who was left on their own. And that was a powerful piece of work. St Patrick's Institution has been a bane of the Irish childcare advocate for 30 years, since the 80s. St Patrick's Institution was meant to be a temporary solution for young people from 16 upwards, 16, 17-year-olds, but it turned out to be a housing unit for all those time. Excuse me. Again, we had no right, we had no remit to go into St Patrick's Institution. We couldn't take complaints from there. It was specifically barred by our legislation. But again, Emily, working with our legislation that allowed us to hear the voice of the child, went in to have a project to meet these children. We spent 4, 5, 6 months going in, meeting them, doing art with them, doing drama with them, finding a way that they could speak their words in the safest possible manner, and learning about what was going on for them. She produced a very, very hard-hitting report, which, on top of the number of hard-hitting reports coming from the Inspector of Prisons, really put pressure on the government. As it turned out then, in 2012, the legislation changed that allowed both us to investigate any complaints within St Patrick's Institution and St Patrick's or other institutions to take the 16-year-olds. So the 16-year-olds from 2012 onwards, I think it was July, were moved out to Oberstown, which is a detention centre as opposed to a prison. So it has proper education, there's proper therapy, there's proper assessments, much different environment. The 17-year-olds were then moved to Wheatfield, which again is still a prison, an adult prison, not an ideal situation, but it's a stopgap scenario. They're now out there. I think the last time I chatted, I spoke to the governor out there just after Christmas. I think there was 14 young men in there, 17 years of age, in a unit on their own, much better than it was in the dilapidated old St Patrick's Institution. Much better looked after, much better provided, much better facilities, much better staff, training, and people who have volunteered to be there as the trainers, as the staff of young people. There's still, unfortunately, because of a glitch in the law, there's still 3 or 4 children every week going into St Patrick's Institution on remand. So they're not actually, when they're not convicted, they end up in St Patrick's Institution. There is ongoing work in Oberstown to build up the facilities and the staffing. My last update is that we expect the 17-year-olds who are on remand to be moving out to Oberstown by March, and hopefully the people out of Wheatfield by summertime. It's a bit slower than we would have liked, and I'll certainly be pushing for that to move as fast as it can, but it's a huge step forward from the old institutional settings. Young people experiencing homelessness. This is one where we spoke to, again, and there's a real change in that. I think it's something we'll have to revisit. At that time, young people experiencing homelessness was the 17-year-olds who had probably been in residential centres or fallen out with their parents or fell out with their foster carers and had left and were on their own on the streets, and they were looking for emergency accommodation. They were going to the Garda station waiting for a social worker to come in after hours or whatever it might be to try and get into homeless shelters. And many of them were barred because of previous behaviour, so they didn't actually get into the shelters. So we ran an investigation. The HSE, as it was at that time, made a lot of changes while we were doing the investigation, so we discontinued the investigation, and a lot of the improvements have carried on from there. However, what we're finding now in 2015, ironically and unfortunately, is that we're getting a few more complaints, a lot more complaints now about families with young children in homeless situations. Single parents, married couples, cohabiting couples with young children, and there's a lot more issues there. So that's something I might have to think about how we tackle properly. We're hearing situations where families with young children are being held in hotels, give public nurse appointment. The child might only be 4 weeks old. Public health nurse has to come to visit them. They visit them, come back for the next visit, and they're gone because the hotel had a booking for something else and they moved them to a different hotel. So they're actually changed outside of the public health nurse's area, and the public health nurse doesn't know where to go with a speech and language therapist. So all those sort of issues, which weren't there even just 5 years ago, are now coming to the fore, and there's something we need to tackle. Dealing with bullying at school, again, a hugely important piece of work we did. We invite schools to come into our space, and we run workshops, 2.5 hour workshops from children from first class all the way through to transition year. And part of that, what we did in 2013, is we asked each group, up to 300 people, what they thought of bullying was, how they defined it, what they would do to fix it, what they think are important issues that need to be fixed within schools in relation to bullying. And we produced a report. And I would say at least 50 to 60% of that report is mirrored in what the Department of Education did in their anti-bullying policy procedures, which have now been rolled out to every single school. And the important, again, listening to the voice of the child, the important piece for me, I sat down with many of these children. The concept of restorative justice was written all over every child. They didn't use those words. They sat down and said, you know what, we can't fix this unless we talk to the bully. Every one of them knew that that was impossible. There's no point in helping me if I'm bullied and moving me here if the bully still goes on to do it to my friend. So straight away, they were in a whole different space to where adults normally would go. And that was hugely encouraging for me. And again, the fact that we listened to them, put it out in a report, and the report, coincidentally, had a lot of similarities with what the Department of Education came up with. And I think that was very, very powerful again. So the workshops we do twice weekly educational workshops. So we average about 12 to 1,300 children a year. We've had schools from 17 different counties. For some reason, it's one of the targets I'll have is try and get the other 9. The mathematics not great. In there as often as possible. So for us, what it does, that space there you can see here, that's where we do it. There's loads of beanbags, they love it, great buzz. They come in here, you give them 5 minutes in the beanbags, and all of a sudden they're able to focus after that. They jump and they scream and they roll and they do everything else. And we're just around the corner from there. So for me, it really reminds us every time they come in why we're doing this work, what it's about. You know, when we're struggling with a complaint that's very, very difficult, we can go around, we can meet the children, we can bump into them, we can talk to them, and it really gives a real buzz and energy to the office. We've produced materials for teachers in primary school and secondary school that are free on the web, or they can write to us and help them talk about human rights issues. We just pick things like family or name, ask the children, the young people, what they feel is important, and it really gives a real sense of ownership to them. And especially at the older age groups, if we have a class that comes in maybe in 4th class, the same class might come back again in transition year and they're doing a project on civil rights or whatever. It really adds up and fits in. And all of a sudden you then have children who are ready to look after themselves in a much different way, and they become parents who become different. Our whole idea is that we're creating a new generation who understand their own rights, and they understand how honoured they are to be in Ireland, despite the problems. When they, a young fellow that sat down, I think 15 years of age, and he couldn't understand why we had war, a right against war. He said, it'd be great to have a machine gun. I said, I'm sure it would be. Every man knows to have a machine gun. I said, but what do you think if your 7-year-old brother had it? He wouldn't be able to. I know, but that's children war. That's what happens when war happens and children aren't being protected. They're given the guns as well. And it started to make sense to them. So as opposed to it just being a fun thing or a sticker on the wall that says you have a right to not to be in war, it didn't make sense to him. But all of a sudden it became real and became part of his family. He could understand it from that point of view. And that's great education for them, and it's something that we're all very proud of. Okay, the independent complaints handling. So for the last 2.5 years, I've been the Director of Investigations here. Keep an eye on me if I go over time. I don't know what the timeline is. We take complaints made by or on behalf of children. The majority of the complaints are made by, 75% are made by parents. Another 6% are made by grandparents. And then there's another 2 or 3% on extended family, uncles, brothers, sisters. And then there's about 6% done by professionals, which is great. Which, we always try to work with professionals and postgraduates who become advocates and informants, not the right word, but just experts who know where they are as an office and they can point people in the right direction. 3% of complaints come from children, and I know there's been some people who are concerned about that. It's one of the things I had a concern about when I came in first. But in reality, when you think about what we have to do, we are the end of the line for an appeal. If a child, say the child isn't happy with the way a bullying complaint was dealt with, they have to obviously talk to their teacher. If they're not happy with that, they have to talk to the principal. If they're not happy with that, they have to talk to the board of directors or board of management. and then they might come to us. That's very unlikely for any child. It's a lot to ask of any child. So generally, we're delighted that the parents are advocating for their child. The 3%, and again, this will be international standard, will be around 3 to 4% will be right. The children who do come to us tend to be children either in prison or in direct care service, residential services or something like that. So they have unfortunately, they've learnt an independence, and they've learnt from each other that you can ring the Ombudsman, or the advocate has told them the Ombudsman is there for them. And the system is a little bit shorter. They complain about one thing, and that's the end of it. There's no further appeals, so they can tend to come to us. But when we have to ask every complainant, have they exhausted local procedures? So that's part of the reason that the children tend not to be the big numbers for us. But again, that suits us fine. We're delighted that the family are engaged and are willing to come to us. That's the way it should be. We look at public bodies, schools and voluntary hospitals, and then, as I said, in brackets, the reviewable agencies. That's the agencies that might be funded directly by government but are not a government agency initially. We have to be independent and impartial. So again, that's one of the things, the big misconceptions about our organisation is that as soon as a child comes to us, we take the child's side. And that's not our role. Our role, the statement in the legislation is that we have to be neither an advocate for the child nor an adversary to the public body. And that's a tight line to walk, very difficult line to walk. And it often leads to frustration on the parts of parents or advocates who might be coming to us. Because we have to hear what they say, we have to put the case to them, and we have to believe what they say unless there's contrary evidence. So we're all the time looking for local procedures. We respect local procedures, and we often revert back to seek local resolution. The intervention is based on, if we get involved in a case and we look to move it to investigation level, we're looking to see, the legislation says there may be an adverse effect on a child and there may be maladministration on behalf of the public body. So those are our two guidelines. We don't have to prove there was adverse effect, we just have to prove there may have been before we go into investigation. But we're always walking that line to see what the evidence is presenting to us. And again, when the parent or an advocate comes to us, they're very clear that there's been an adverse effect because it wouldn't have come to us. But they're not quite always sure where the maladministration might be, and vice versa. So we have to keep that very calm, clear line on the procedure. And it's oftentimes why we have a huge number of local resolutions. Part of all ombudsmans across the world, part of the principles is to encourage local resolutions. So if you're working in a school and you come in and there's an issue with a relationship in school, we would oftentimes ask the parents to go back to the school. We would also write to the board of management and say, listen, we've had a complaint here. Is there anything you can do at this stage? And oftentimes that's all you need. You just have to let them know we're on the pitch and there's a bit of pressure that brings a new resolution to that. And that can be hugely effective. Why oftentimes we'd have people concerned that we don't do enough investigations. But our job is to get the problem solved and allow the children to move forward in the best way possible. We have to take account of the best interest of the child. Oftentimes our investigations, before I came, one of the big things I've worked on is the length of time. Some of our investigations have taken up 3 and 4 years. We're now down to about 18 months. The target is 16 months for this year. So if you're in a difficult situation in a school or in a hospital or somewhere, it's better to get the thing fixed than to wait 14 or 15 months for us to tell them how to fix it. So that's oftentimes the way we work. So we try to work it in the best way possible. And again, we're working that neither an advocate for the child nor an adversary to the public body. And it's that fairness and independence that allows us to work both sides. Numbers-wise, I'm not giving you any exclusives on our annual report yet, so we're about 10,000 plus now for 2014. Huge numbers building all the time. We're about 10 or 12% increase since 2012. This year's, it's been very, very high. So I think we're going to plateau somewhere around 1,600 a year complaints, and that's a huge number for, again, we have a small team. I have about 10 people in the complaints and investigations side, and we work them very, very solidly. But it's really, what we're showing here is an increase in awareness of our office as well, and I think it's something that we could grow as people become more and more aware of what we can do within the office, and the public bodies become more aware of the necessity to refer people to us. Dominant themes over the years. So what are the problems that we've encountered consistently? Excessive bureaucracy. I don't think that'll be a shock to anybody in this room. Anyone who's filled in too many pieces of paper. lack of ensuring the children's voices are heard and the views appropriately considered. Again, that's not a surprise to a lot of people at certain levels. There's certain departments that I suppose just have no interaction with children. They make decisions at the highest level. They've never seen a child. They don't know what a child is, and they don't consider the voice. They consider the policy and the procedures. Policy implementation appears to dominate over the rights and best interests of the principal. So this is one of the big, exciting things for me this year. Hopefully, without prejudging anything, if the Jordan case, which is the challenge to the children's referendum, comes, if that doesn't succeed, then we will have every single public body will have to be mindful of the children's voice and participate. Have the child participate at the best interests and hear the child's voice. Every single one of them will have to consider that. So we will then, in turn, be able to hold them to account against that. Show me how you did this in this case. How did you hear this child's voice, and how did you consider their best interests? That's going to make a phenomenal change in public services. We had one agency send us in a leaflet of theirs, which they were very, very proud of because they got ahead of the curve and they'd written up their procedures with copying most of the stuff off our website about the best interests and hearing the voice of the child. They were delighted with themselves and they thought they'd be proud that we'd pat them on the back. First question one of our investigators asked them, so how are you going to actually do that? So again, it's that thinking, we've got it in our paper, we've got it on paper, everything's okay. That's us covered. But the reality is that as soon as you put it on paper, I'm going to challenge you to show me how you did it. And that's the way we're going to change public services, hopefully. That'll make a real difference to children. It's going to be difficult. They won't be able to do it every single time, but they're going to have to work towards it. So I'm hoping in my 5 or 6 years in this office, 6 years from now, we will have a different set of public servants who are totally aware of what they're doing and the connection between what they do on floor 5 and what happens to the child in the school or in the hospital or wherever it might be. The lack of awareness of their impact. So a good example that I always give in that one, lack of awareness of decision making. We had a young mother who had a problem with housing. I think it was sort of a rental thing. I'm not quite sure the actual thing. She applied. There was a deadline. She applied. It went in. The person who was receiving it was on holidays. Eventually, when they came back, it was out of date. By the time they came back from holidays, they sent it back to her. And then she filled it in again because they gave her an extension because he was on holidays. Sent it back in. He said, that's the wrong area. Sent it back to her again. She had to fill in another form and send it to another area. It was out of date by the time it got to the other area. When we explored it, we realised that the 2 areas were sitting beside each other. And just stuff like that, you just sort of think, okay, guys, the policy says it has to go out and back in again, but let's start thinking past the policy. Let's start thinking, what's the best interest of this child here? Because it was clear that she would be eligible for what she needed. And the only reason she lost out was in their administration of it. And I think those sort of things can start to be thought about a little bit better if the Constitution and all the legislation that comes with it is changed. Children's rights in general are not part of what a civil servant or a public servant deals with. There's no concept of it. And to be fair, I'll put my hands up and say I wouldn't have had a huge amount of it either. But I think it's something that can be brought into the new training, there's hopefully there'll be a new influx over the years. And then as the boats start to rise and we start to hire people again, people become a little bit more aware of the overall rights of the child. So those are sort of themes. Just to give you examples, within the Department of Education, this is one that we published, I think, at the start of 2014. A young boy came to Ireland with his family, got into a school, had to go back home he was outside of the EU, went back home with his parents, went through some terrible traumas, came back alone, got into a foster family, got settled down, applied for school. He had been expelled from the school before he went back to his own country. When applied for school said no. Eventually, with the help of a social worker and an educational welfare officer, they worked extremely hard and applied to 26 different schools, and every one of them said no. The answer was that the Department of Education paid for home tuition for 2 years for this young man. 9 hours a week was the maximum they could get in home tuition, whereas if he was in school, secondary school at that stage, he would have been getting 28 hours minimum and maybe a little bit more. Obviously, there's other bits and pieces that go with different types of school, but that's the minimum that would happen in school. When we explored it, the Department of Education were very clear. The 26 schools had nothing to do with us. We went to the 26 schools, didn't go to them all, but the 26 schools were all clear that they had followed their own guidelines and done everything right. So we're the Ombudsman for Children. We look at administration. Did they follow the policies? Did they have the policies? Did they have the procedures? Did they follow them? And the answer to each one of those, yes. None of them did anything wrong. But the system let the child down. Our constitution says that every child is entitled to full education, or may be entitled to. But what we did then was we said, listen, we have to go with a moral suasion argument. You can't allow a child to sit in this situation. The answer that they came back with was, apart from the schools being autonomous, the answer was that the parents or the foster parents or the social worker could have applied an appeal to each school. I don't know if any of you have seen it, what the Section 29 is called. In that situation, it takes 2 months, and you can't run them concurrently. So 26 2 months. That's a lot of months to wait to see if one of the schools might crack and let him in the door. And in true Irish fashion, the child got in the door when somebody happened to bump into somebody's chairman of somewhere, and they said, okay, I'll get you a place. But that doesn't help the overall system. That doesn't help for the next child who's found in that situation. We're currently in arguments with the Department of Education, and we're still working on the fine-tuning this. But that's one of the contributions that the Education Admissions Bill is meant to come to fix. They are now giving the responsibility and the power to the educational worker, education welfare officer, who is now part of TUSLA, Child and Family Agency. They will now have the power to designate a school in that situation. If it's proven and shown that the parents have made every effort to get into schools, and the schools haven't been able to facilitate them, then one of them will be forced, for want of a better word, designated. One of the questions we've asked is, will that come with resources? Because the last thing you want is one in and somebody else kicked out, or one in and the headmaster gives out yards because they won't take the next one, and why designate us? Because they can appeal the designation. So we want to make sure that it doesn't break the system either. You've got to make the system work. We can see there's things we know can go wrong. Let's fix it before you make it happen. So that's an important contribution to that. They're very clear. They continuously come back to us when I ask for what's the guidelines. They haven't got guidelines or criteria yet. Like, one of the questions I would ask there is, should they have come in after 4 schools? After 6 schools? 7 schools? What's the right answer? I mean, if you're in Dublin, even if you're in Dublin, by the time, if you want to go to school here, by the time you get to 26, you're probably out in Wicklow or Meath. So if you start in Donegal and you want to go to 26 schools, I don't know where you'd be. So what's the number? What criteria puts up the red flag? In theory, we already have, if this child's out of school for 20 days, his parents could be prosecuted. But yet we won't put them into school, and won't find a school. So it's those sort of fine-tuning things that we want to try and figure out as well. So we'll keep on their case for another while longer on that one. We've done a piece of research. I won't go into that, but it's again, all this stuff is on our website. That's an expertise in relation to children in care, and I'll talk a little bit more about them in a little while. TUSLA, let me just remember this one. This is in relation to support for a foster parent who was a relative. Again, informal situation where a child wasn't being able to be catered for by their own parent. The grandparents were in negotiations with the HSE, as it was then, to foster the child, or to look after the child in an informal fostering situation. It didn't work out there, so the aunt took them on. She was getting support through the Section 10 support up until 2008. It was supposed to be signed off for 2009 by the social worker. The social worker left. Nobody signed off on it. When the next social worker comes in, the aunt goes back looking for it again, and some other administrator says, no, that's not going to work. You're not entitled to it. It's an informal situation. We're not paying you for it. The reality was, when we went into it, that everything pointed to it being a formal situation that never was signed off on. Since then, we went into it, we investigated. Both the financial and other supports were withheld inappropriately. So the aunt lost a lot of money, carried on caring for the child, but the child lost out enormously. When we went into it only last year I think we finalised it. TUSLA, it must have been last year TUSLA did it, so they only came into being in January of last year. They agreed to reinstate and backdate the payments. The aunt only came to us because she was looking for money to pay for grinds for the son, or for her nephew as he was. She didn't want any backdating necessarily, but she wanted to make sure that the child got the best possible advantage. And again, we're in situations where it works, the Irish system works when you get the right people there all the time, but when the right person moves off, we're back. So our administration doesn't support the right of the individual child to be heard properly. And that's what we're trying to fix, so that it isn't left to the individuals. It isn't a wink and a nod and the right person in the right place at the right time. It has to be the system right. Just in relation to mental health, we looked at a case recently where a 16-year-old was admitted, psychiatric issue, I think it was suicidal depression. Went in after 2 months in a proper adolescent unit. Consultant and the young person himself were happy that he didn't need to be there any longer, so he wasn't able to go back to his home. So they rang the HSE as it was, and there was no residential centre to bring them to. So this young man spent 4 months travelling from there to a school, pretending he was still at home, or trying to keep life going as best he could in a psychiatric unit with no need to be there and uncertain legal scenarios, until eventually we got involved, and within a week we decided we got a complaint on a Monday. I said I'd send a team down there the following Monday to interview people. On the Friday before that Monday, he was moved. It doesn't make sense. You know, everybody in the unit knew he needed to be moved. Everybody in HSE knew he needed to be moved. But you've got to find situations where this can't happen anymore. And again, we also know from the other side, we have complaints about young children who can't get into units, adolescent units. And there's a man here who doesn't need to be there for 4 months, blocking a bed, for want of a better word. So there's a whole lot of knock-on effects. And these are the sort of things that we need to work at a higher level. And that's things that I would have ongoing negotiations with the CEOs and the boards of TUSLA and the Department of Children and Youth Affairs as well. So it's a really cogent example of where the problems can double and treble if you don't fix the first one. This is just an example. As TUSLA was being set up, we were very clear that we'd had a lot of issues with children in care over the last 10 years, and there have been a lot of repeated of the same issues. We were fed up investigating them, so we wanted to lay them clearly at their door. We created a meta-analysis. We had over 1,000 cases in 10 years in relation to children in care. We took 10 representative cases, and the 7 issues that came up were assessment and care planning. Sometimes they were being done and weren't being passed on. So a psychologist would do a great job in Unit A. Child would move on 3 months later, and they'd have all the behaviour support plans and everything. Wouldn't be passed on, or would be passed on and left in a box somewhere. And then the new unit would start again and the poor child would go absolutely ape. Record keeping, very simple stuff. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but my training was, as soon as I pick up a phone, I have a pen saying, this is the time and phone call, who's calling me, what it's about, taking notes. We would often find cases where a child would move from A, B and C. There'd be files in A, B and C. There'd be same stuff in A, B and C, and then there'll be some stuff that isn't in A and some stuff that's in B and some stuff not in C, and the file keeping, record keeping, and again, you're in situations where this is a child's life. And I know from personal example, I know friends of mine worked in England 25 years ago. The rule is in England, when you go to school, the public health nurse gives that one record that she has for everything that's ever happened to you to the school nurse. She has possession till you go to secondary school, and it goes to the secondary school nurse, and every case conference, anything is in that file. It's one file, and it's passed. And it's a very clear line of responsibility. We still haven't got to that. It's moving on. Residential care, so is the right residential care right level? Is it in the right geographical area? Are you actually defeating the purpose by bringing the girl from Cork to Dublin because all her supports are in Cork, all her family and everything else? And does she act out because she's in Dublin, or does she act out because she's in a residential centre? So those sort of areas. Child protection, we were very concerned that issues that happen in residential centres that are serious child protection issues, if a child runs away and gets engaged in some sort of dangerous behaviour, whether it's sexual or alcohol or drugs, in that case, if that was a parent, the child would be taken out and put into care. But because it's the care service, there's not the same sense of it. We had situations where the guards were concerned about certain actions, but the HSE didn't follow the same procedures as they would do if a parent had been reported for it. So it's just those sort of slightly difficult areas. Social work practice. So again, we were very clear that per social workers, we were tough, unbelievably difficult scenarios where a social worker might be 1 year out getting some of the most difficult cases and maybe getting supervision once every 10 months. We had numerous cases where there was gaps of 6 months between supervision, and even that supervision wasn't recorded, and the actions that came from it were not recorded. So it's very, very unfair on them to try and deal with those situations. Interprofessional multi-agent, so, and this was before CAM was separated from TUSLA. There wasn't proper inter-agency cooperation. Child moved from Dublin to Waterford. CAMS didn't follow, or social worker didn't follow, or CAMS wouldn't take them in Wicklow or in Waterford because there was no social worker to support them. It just, all those sort of things that had nothing to do with the child and were nothing to do with the best interest of the child, they were all based on money or resources or whatever, were interfering with the best outcomes for the child. So those are things we highlight. What we did with this then, just to cut to the chase, we brought this to the Minister for Children and Youth Affairs. We brought it into the Oireachtas through Health and Children Committee, and I also presented to the CEOs and the board of TUSLA. So we said, here you are now, this is your job as the Oireachtas to deal with these issues. The next time you have TUSLA in, and they have them in every 6 months, please ask them how they're dealing with these issues. So we have, and to be fair, we haven't, I think we've had maybe 1 or 2 cases in the same issues since then. And I've also set up a system that if there's something that I think is really serious that relates to any of these, I will pick up the phone immediately to the highest level and say, can you fix this? Because we've already dealt with that. So it's really worked out very, very well from our point of view. They've made huge changes. I'll be fair to them. They've improved the record-keeping training. Supervision is happening. They're providing resources for supervision at all levels, not just the ground social worker, the principal social worker is supposed to get time. New governance structures through this TUSLA. National Director for Residential Care, so they have one person in charge and they have a team that allow children in. So a social worker anywhere in the country should be able to pick up the phone and ring one team that will get them a bed and they're getting access to that. So it's a really important piece for us. The progress that is made through this is through the work since the Ombudsman for Children came in. Closure of St Patrick's Institution, we find that as a huge milestone. I think Emily will say it in any of her interviews. That's the thing she's proudest of, because it really was a horrible setting. Really was probably nothing more than a breeding ground for more danger and violence and heartache for young people. Overstown is building a phenomenal new unit out there, a new setup, going to have 6 different units, bringing it all together. It's not going to be perfect. It's a detention centre. It's never going to be fabulous, but it's a huge change from an adult Victorian style building. Children's referendum, huge step forward. Emily always tells the story that how she can't believe how naive she was when her very first press interview she asked for a referendum and nobody was even talking about it at that stage, but she feels that just even by starting it then it really made a huge difference. And the time, and again this is the one thing I've seen over the last 2.5 years, is that it's about starting the conversation and then being patient from then on. She started that conversation in 2004. There was a joint committee put together in 2006 to get up wording for a children's referendum. It got something through, it fell down. It started again in 2010. It ended up with Mary O'Rourke in there, and that really drove it. So it's all about getting the right timing, the right people, and that's the patience in this job, is that you have to see ahead and keep pushing it. The increased awareness of our organisation as a free, independent, credible alternative to court, because that's our option. That's what we're here for. We're here to make sure that nobody has to go to court, so that anybody who hasn't got the deep pockets to go to the High Court or to sue somebody or to take the risk to sue somebody has an option. Our recommendations are strong. They're not binding because we work on the principle of relationships. But we have found that in 95% of our cases, even if they don't accept our findings, they will follow through in the recommendations in all the organisations. And that's oftentimes, that will happen. We'll have fights over, we don't believe that's the right finding, but we'll take on your suggestions on board and we'll follow through them. And we constantly follow. We have a 6-month follow-up in every investigation, every set of recommendations. And we'd be following through in cases for 2 and 3 years just to make sure that they do it the way we expect it to be done. So that's the progress that we've made in the last 10 years, and it's been, hopefully, it's up to me now to make progress from here on in. I'm not quite sure what it'll look like in 6 years' time, but hopefully there will be progress. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm quite happy to take any questions you might have at this stage. Just before, this is the bit where I didn't have the psychology bit. I've done this before, I likened psychology, governance, the definition of governance for me, I count it as accountability, good standards, consistency, client-centred and safe. If that doesn't define psychology, I don't know what does. If I'm a good psychologist, I'm going to be accountable, I'm going to have good standards, I'm going to be consistent, I'm going to be safe, and I'm going to be client-centred. So that's what I try to bring to my work, is to keep the name of the child at the centre. If you're carrying a case for 2 or 3 years, it very quickly becomes the Murphy case or the Smith case or the Andrews case, whatever it might be. Every single time an investigator comes into me and we want to talk about a case, tell me the name of the child. So it becomes Mary and John every single time. And I think that's what I bring as opposed to somebody else. That's what I bring. I'm not going to compare myself to anybody else. But to me, that allows me then to keep the best interest of the child alive when I'm trying to make decisions, whether it goes forward or not go forward or whatever it is. But that, to me, is the psychology training that I bring, and also a high standard of, I'm not going to say ethics, but just accepting the best, expecting the best from people. I think that's what every child should have as an advocate or somebody looking out for them. And that's what I try to do in each case. So, thank you. So, any questions?